Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
I stepped out of the yellow taxicab onto the familiar cobblestone driveway of my grandparents' house, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across their perfectly manicured lawn. The driver handed me my change, and I watched him pull away, leaving me standing alone with nothing but the sound of crickets and my own racing heartbeat. This was going to be harder than I thought. As I walked toward the front door, my grandfather appeared on the porch, his weathered face lighting up with that warm smile I had always loved. But then his expression shifted, confusion replacing joy, as he glanced past me toward the empty driveway. "Buddy, why did you come by taxi?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "What happened to the BMW we gave you for your 22nd birthday?" This was not the first time something like this had happened, not even close. Growing up in our house meant learning early that Emma was the golden child, the precious daughter who could do no wrong, while I was just Christopher, the son who was expected to understand, to be mature, to always put his sister's needs before his own. I remembered my high school graduation, how proud I had been when my grandparents gave me a beautiful silver watch, engraved with my initials and the date. It was the first expensive gift I had ever owned, and I wore it every day for 3 weeks. Then Emma's junior prom came around, and suddenly my mother decided that Emma needed something elegant to complete her look. The watch disappeared from my dresser and appeared on Emma's wrist, where it stayed for the rest of high school. When I protested, my mother sat me down with that disappointed expression and explained how selfish I was being, how Emma had so many important events coming up, how I should be a better big brother. The laptop my grandparents bought me for starting community college suffered the same fate 6 months later. Emma was beginning her sophomore year at the prestigious private school across town, and she needed something better than the family computer for her advanced classes. My laptop, with all my carefully organized files and half-finished assignments, was reformatted and handed over to my sister. I had to finish my first semester using the library computers, staying until closing time every night, walking the 3 miles home in the dark because I could not afford gas for my beat-up Honda Civic. Even my part-time job earnings were not safe from redistribution. The money I saved from working weekends at the local grocery store, intended for textbooks and basic living expenses, somehow always found its way into Emma's cheerleading fund or her college prep course fees. My mother had a way of making it sound reasonable, necessary, temporary. She would promise to pay me back once things settled down, once Emma got her scholarship, once the finances improved. But things never settled down, and the promises were never kept. My father, Robert, played his role perfectly as the silent enabler. He would sit at the dinner table, reading his newspaper or checking his phone, while my mother redistributed my possessions and opportunities to Emma. When I tried to speak up, he would clear his throat and mumble something about family responsibility and not being selfish. He never looked me in the eye during these conversations, never acknowledged that anything unfair was happening. His silence was almost worse than my mother's manipulation, because at least she was actively participating in the dynamic. My father was just letting it happen. The BMW had been different, though. When my grandparents surprised me with it for my 22nd birthday, I thought finally I had something that was truly mine. It was a gorgeous midnight blue sedan, only 2 years old, with leather seats and a sound system that made my heart race every time I turned the key. For 3 months, I drove that car to work, to school, to the grocery store, feeling for the first time in my life like I mattered, like I deserved nice things too. Then Emma turned 18 and started her senior year at Preston Academy, the $15,000 per year private school that was supposed to guarantee her acceptance into an Ivy League college. Suddenly, my mother decided that taking the bus was beneath Emma's social status. The family's 10-year-old minivan was too embarrassing for someone of Emma's caliber. My BMW, sitting in the driveway looking beautiful and reliable, was the obvious solution. I was not even consulted. I came home from my warehouse job one evening, exhausted from loading trucks for 10 hours, to find Emma in my driveway, washing my car like it belonged to her. My mother stood on the porch, arms crossed, with that familiar expression that meant the decision had already been made, and any protest from me would be considered inappropriate. "Emma needs reliable transportation for her senior year," she announced. "You can take the bus or walk. Young men your age need the exercise anyway." Sitting at my grandparents' dining room table now, surrounded by the familiar smells of pot roast and apple pie, I felt that same knot of anger and helplessness tightening in my stomach. My grandmother, Helen, bustled around serving dinner, her gray hair perfectly styled despite being in the kitchen all afternoon. She had always been the heart of our family gatherings, the one who remembered everyone's favorite dishes and made sure no one left hungry. "Christopher, sweetheart," she said, setting a heaping plate in front of me. "I hope those monthly checks we send are helping with your college expenses. Your grandfather and I are so proud that you are working toward your degree, even if it is taking a little longer than traditional students." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I nearly choked on the bite of mashed potatoes I had just taken. Monthly checks? My mind reeled as I tried to process what my grandmother had just said. I looked across the table at my mother, who had suddenly become very interested in cutting her meat, her face flushed red. "What monthly checks?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother looked confused, glancing between my mother and me. "The $500 we send every month to help with your tuition and expenses, dear. We have been doing it for almost 2 years now. Your mother said you were too proud to ask for help directly, so we have been sending the money to her to pass along to you." The room started spinning. $500 a month for 2 years. That was $12,000. $12,000 that I had never seen, never even known existed. I had been working double shifts at the warehouse, living on instant ramen and generic cereal, sleeping 4 hours a night to balance work and school, believing that I was completely on my own. I had been walking to work in the rain, taking 3 buses to get to campus, wearing the same 5 shirts over and over because I could not afford new clothes. Meanwhile, Emma had been living like a princess. Her private school tuition was $15,000 per year, which meant my grandparents' money was paying nearly half of it. She had name-brand clothes, a full meal plan at school, money for activities and social events. She drove my BMW to her after-school job at a boutique in the rich part of town, where she earned spending money for makeup and jewelry that I could never dream of affording. My grandfather, Harold, had stopped eating entirely, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth as he watched the exchange. His accountant's mind was clearly working, adding up numbers, calculating totals, recognizing financial irregularities when he saw them. My mother was still staring at her plate, and my father had that familiar deer-in-headlights expression that meant he knew something was wrong but did not want to get involved. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Where is that money?" She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. "Christopher, sweetie, that money has been going toward your expenses, just like your grandmother said. Your books, your gas money, your food." "I buy my own books," I said through gritted teeth. "I do not have a car to put gas in, and I live on $10 a week for food. Where is the money, Mom?" The silence at the table was deafening. My grandmother looked stricken. My grandfather's face was growing darker by the second, and my father was staring at his hands like they held the answers to the universe. Emma, who had been quietly eating her dinner, finally looked up with an expression of confusion that seemed genuine. Maybe she did not know either. Maybe she thought her charmed life was just normal, that everyone lived the way she did. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but really I needed to get away from the table before I said something I could not take back. Standing in my grandparents' guest bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a young man who looked older than his 24 years. The stress lines around my eyes, the way my shoulders permanently slumped from exhaustion, the cheap clothes that I had owned for years because I could not afford to replace them. I had been living like a pauper while my sister lived like royalty, funded by money that was supposed to be mine. The rage that had been building in my chest for months finally crystallized into determination. I was going to tell my grandparents everything, every stolen gift, every redirected dollar, every time I had been made to feel selfish for wanting basic fairness. I was going to lay it all out on the table, regardless of the consequences, because I could not live with this deception for one more day. I walked back to the dining room with my heart pounding, ready to finally tell the truth about everything. My grandparents deserved to know where their money had really gone, and I deserved to have my side of the story heard. I sat down at the table and took a deep breath, gathering my courage for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. Grandpa, Grandma, I began carefully. I need to tell you something important about the money you have been sending. I have never received any of it. Not $1. I had no idea you were even sending money until just now. My mother's face went completely white, and she set down her fork with a shaking hand. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but remained silent as always. I continued, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. The BMW you gave me for my birthday is now Emma's car. She drives it to school every day while I take 3 buses to get to my community college classes. The money you thought was helping me with school has been paying for Emma's private school tuition instead. I have been working 60-hour weeks at a warehouse, trying to pay for my own education, while believing I had no help from anyone. Before I could say more, something unexpected happened. My mother suddenly burst into tears, loud, dramatic sobs that immediately drew everyone's attention away from my words. Through her tears, she began speaking in a voice that trembled with emotion. "I cannot believe you are doing this," she wailed, looking at me with an expression of betrayal and hurt. "I cannot believe you are trying to sabotage your sister's future because you are jealous of her success." I stared at her in shock, completely unprepared for this response. She was turning the entire situation around, making herself the victim and me the villain. Before I could defend myself, she continued her tearful monologue. "Christopher has always resented Emma," she said to my grandparents, her voice breaking with each word. "Ever since she started excelling in school, he has been bitter and angry. Emma is graduating valedictorian from Preston Academy. She has been accepted to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And instead of being proud of his sister, Christopher is trying to destroy everything she has worked for." My father, who had been silent throughout dinner, finally spoke up, but not in the way I had hoped. "Your mother is right, Christopher. This jealousy has gone too far. Emma has been working incredibly hard, and she deserves our support. You need to grow up and stop trying to tear down your sister every time she achieves something." I felt like I had been slapped. My own father, who knew exactly what had been happening in our house, was choosing to support my mother's lies rather than stand up for the truth. My grandmother looked confused and hurt, glancing between my mother's tears and my shocked expression. "Christopher," my grandmother said gently, "is this true? Have you been causing problems at home because of Emma's achievements?" Before I could answer, my mother pulled out her phone and began showing my grandparents pictures and documents. Emma's report cards showing straight A's, her acceptance letters from prestigious universities, photos of her receiving academic awards and scholarship offers, photos of her volunteering at the local animal shelter, and participating in charity events. In every picture, Emma looked like the perfect daughter, beautiful, accomplished, surrounded by friends and opportunities. "Look at everything Emma has accomplished," my mother said, wiping her eyes. "She is going to be the first person in our family to attend an Ivy League school. She has a full scholarship to Princeton, and instead of celebrating her success, Christopher is here trying to convince you that we have been stealing from him." My grandfather was looking at the photos with a confused expression, clearly trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what I had been telling them. My grandmother reached across the table and patted my mother's hand sympathetically. "Christopher," my grandmother said, her voice filled with disappointment. "If Emma is doing so well in school and has earned these scholarships, then surely you can see why the family resources need to support her success. Maybe the car situation is not ideal, but if Emma needs reliable transportation for her college interviews and activities, then perhaps you should be willing to make that sacrifice for your sister." I felt the walls closing in around me. Everything I had said was being twisted into evidence of my own selfishness and jealousy. The financial deception, the stolen gifts, the years of unfair treatment. All of it was being reframed as necessary sacrifices to support Emma's bright future. My grandparents, who had always loved me unconditionally, were looking at me with disappointment and confusion. "But the money," I said desperately. "The $12,000 you sent for my education." She used it for Emma's private school tuition instead of giving it to me. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and spoke in a voice that sounded reasonable and maternal. "Christopher, that money did go toward education, just not yours directly. When Emma gets her Princeton degree and becomes successful, she will be able to help the whole family. Sometimes we have to invest in the family member who has the best chance of success. I thought you would understand that." My father nodded along with this explanation, as if it made perfect sense to steal my education money and give it to my sister without even telling me about it. My grandparents were looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the situation. The worst part was that I could see their point of view. Emma really was academically gifted. She really had been accepted to Ivy League schools. On paper, it probably did make more financial sense to invest in the family member who was most likely to achieve significant success. But they did not understand the deeper pattern, the systematic favoritism, the way I had been made to feel worthless and unimportant my entire life. I tried one more time to explain, but my mother's tears and Emma's achievements had already won the day. My grandparents suggested that maybe we should all take some time to cool down and think about things. They offered to drive me home, since I had arrived by taxi, and the conversation ended with hugs that felt hollow and forced. Walking out to my grandfather's car, I felt more alone and defeated than I had ever felt in my life. Not only had I failed to expose the truth, but I had somehow made myself look like the villain in my own story. My grandparents probably thought I was a jealous, immature young man who could not handle his sister's success. The ride home was quiet and awkward, and when they dropped me off at my tiny apartment, their goodbyes felt like the end of something important. I spent the next 2 days in a fog of anger and defeat, barely eating, calling in sick to work, and seriously considering just cutting ties with my family completely. The humiliation of being painted as the jealous brother was almost unbearable, especially when I knew the truth about what had really been happening. I started looking at apartments in other cities, thinking maybe it was time to just start over somewhere else where no one knew my history. On the third day, I decided I needed to get my important documents together if I was really going to leave town. My birth certificate, social security card, and passport were all in a filing cabinet in my father's home office, along with other family paperwork. I knew my parents would be at work and Emma would be at school, so I drove my beat-up Honda over to the house to collect my things. The house felt strange and empty, without the usual family chaos. I let myself in with my key and went straight to my father's office, a small room off the main hallway that smelled like coffee and old paper. The filing cabinet was unlocked, as always, and I quickly found the folder with my documents. As I was pulling out my birth certificate, I accidentally bumped the cabinet, and a cardboard box on top of it tumbled to the floor, spilling its contents across the hardwood. Cursing under my breath, I knelt down to clean up the mess, expecting to find old tax returns or insurance paperwork. Instead, I found myself staring at documents that made my blood run cold. The first thing I saw was a birth certificate, but it was not mine. It was Emma's birth certificate, and the father listed was not Robert Mitchell, the man I had always called Dad. The father's name was Marcus Webb, and the address listed was somewhere in Denver, Colorado. I stared at the paper, reading it over and over, unable to process what I was seeing. Emma was not my father's biological daughter. She was not really my sister at all. With shaking hands, I gathered up the other scattered papers. There were letters between my mother and this Marcus Webb, dating back to when Emma was just a baby. Child support payment records showing monthly payments that had stopped when Emma turned 16. Bank statements from an account I had never seen before, labeled Emma's Future Fund, showing deposits that matched exactly with my grandparents' monthly $500 contributions. The timeline became crystal clear as I pieced together the evidence. My mother had gotten pregnant with Emma while dating this Marcus Webb. When Marcus disappeared or refused to marry her, she had quickly started dating my father, who was apparently desperate enough for a relationship that he was willing to raise another man's child as his own. They had married when my mother was 7 months pregnant, which explained why Emma had always seemed to arrive so early in their marriage timeline. I was born 2 years later, the legitimate son, but by then the family dynamic was already established. My father resented the situation but felt trapped by his choices. My mother overcompensated for the deception by spoiling Emma and making sure she had every advantage, as if love and material things could somehow make up for the complicated circumstances of her birth. And I, the innocent bystander in all of this, had been treated like an afterthought because my very existence was a reminder of the normal family life that never quite materialized. The child support payments from Marcus had apparently helped fund Emma's early years, but when they stopped, my mother had needed to find other sources of income to maintain Emma's lifestyle. Enter my grandparents' generous monthly contributions, which were supposed to help me, but instead went directly into Emma's education fund. The BMW, the laptop, the graduation watch, all of it made sense now. My mother was not just showing favoritism. She was trying to create a perfect life for Emma that would somehow justify all the lies and deception that had started before Emma was even born. I sat on the floor of my father's office for what felt like hours, surrounded by the evidence of my family's deepest secrets, finally understanding why I had always felt like an outsider in my own home. Emma was not just the favored child. She was the child my mother was desperately trying to save from the circumstances of her birth. My father was not just a passive enabler. He was a man trapped in a lie that had grown bigger and more complicated with each passing year. But understanding the why did not make the pain any less intense. If anything, it made everything worse. Because now I knew that my mistreatment had been systematic and intentional, designed to protect a secret that had poisoned my entire childhood. I had been sacrificed on the altar of family respectability. My needs and feelings deemed less important than maintaining the fiction that we were a normal, happy family. I carefully gathered all the evidence and put it in my backpack, then returned the empty box to the top of the filing cabinet. As I was leaving the house, I realized that I now had a choice to make. I could use this information to destroy my family, exposing the lies and probably ending my parents' marriage in the process. Or I could continue to suffer in silence, knowing the truth but unable to act on it without devastating innocent people. But there was a third option that I had not considered until that moment. I could take this evidence to my grandparents, the only people in my family who had always been honest and fair with me. They deserved to know where their money had really gone, and they deserved to understand why their grandson had been treated so poorly. Maybe, with this proof, I could finally get them to see the truth about what had been happening in our family. 3 days later, I was sitting in my studio apartment, staring at the envelope full of documents on my coffee table, when I heard a knock at my door. I was not expecting anyone, and my first thought was that it might be my parents, coming to retrieve the evidence I had taken. But when I opened the door, I found my grandfather standing there with a serious expression and a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Christopher," he said, "we need to talk." I invited him in, my heart pounding with anxiety and hope. He looked around my tiny apartment, taking in the sparse furnishings, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the textbooks piled on the floor because I could not afford a proper desk. His weathered face showed a mixture of sadness and determination that I had never seen before. "I owe you an apology," he said, settling into my only chair. "I knew something was not right at dinner the other night, and I should have trusted my instincts instead of letting your mother's tears cloud my judgment." I sat down on my bed, facing him, unable to speak. He opened his manila folder and pulled out a stack of bank statements, canceled checks, and what looked like a private investigator's report. "I am a retired accountant," he said, "and I have always kept meticulous records of our family finances. After dinner, I went home and reviewed every check we have sent to your mother over the past 2 years. 23 payments of $500 each, totaling $11,500. I also looked up the tuition costs for Preston Academy and cross-referenced them with Emma's enrollment dates." He handed me a spreadsheet that showed the numbers in black and white. My grandparents' payments corresponded almost exactly with Emma's school payment schedule. There was no way this was a coincidence, but I wanted to be absolutely certain before I accused anyone of anything serious. My grandfather continued, "So I hired a private investigator to do some background research on our family." My heart stopped. If he had hired an investigator, then he probably knew about Emma's true parentage, about the lies that had shaped our entire family dynamic. I pulled out my own envelope of evidence, my hands shaking as I placed it on the small coffee table between us. "Grandpa," I said, "I think I know what your investigator found." For the next hour, we compared our evidence like two detectives working on a case. My grandfather's investigator had been incredibly thorough, not only confirming Emma's true parentage but also tracking down Marcus Webb in Denver, where he now worked as a construction manager and had started a new family. The investigator had also obtained financial records showing that my mother had been systematically diverting my grandparents' money into a separate account that funded Emma's private school education. My grandfather's face grew darker as we reviewed each piece of evidence. "I have been sending money to help my grandson with his education for 2 years," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And not only has he never received a penny of it, but he has been working himself to exhaustion because he thought he had no family support. He told me that after the dinner disaster, he had gone home and really looked at me for the first time in months. The weight loss, the exhaustion, the cheap clothes, the way I had arrived by taxi instead of driving the car they had bought me. All the signs had been there, but he had been too trusting to see them. Your grandmother and I always wondered why you seemed to be struggling so much when we were sending money to help," he admitted. "We thought maybe you were just proud, or that you were not managing your finances well. We never imagined that the money was being stolen." But the financial fraud was not even the worst part, according to my grandfather. The systematic favoritism, the emotional manipulation, the way I had been made to feel selfish and ungrateful for wanting basic fairness, all of it painted a picture of a family that had lost its moral compass in service of protecting a lie. "This has to stop," my grandfather said firmly. "Not only is what your mother did illegal, it is morally reprehensible. You are my grandson, and you deserve better than this." He told me that he had already consulted with a family law attorney about our options. The misappropriation of funds intended for me could potentially be prosecuted as theft or fraud. The systematic deception could be grounds for civil action to recover damages. But more than that, he said, it was time for the truth to come out, regardless of the consequences. "I am going to arrange a family meeting," he said. "Your parents, Emma, your grandmother, and both of us. I am bringing my lawyer and all of this evidence, and I am giving them one chance to make this right voluntarily before we pursue legal action." I felt a surge of emotion that I had not experienced in years. Someone was finally fighting for me. Someone was finally willing to stand up to my mother's manipulation and my father's enabling. My grandfather, who had always been the quiet, steady presence in our family, was revealing a core of steel that I had never seen before. "What if they refuse?" I asked. "What if they deny everything or try to turn it around on us again?" My grandfather's expression was grim but determined. "Then we will take them to court, and we will expose every lie they have ever told. Your father works for a financial services company. A fraud conviction would end his career. Your mother's reputation in the community would be destroyed. Emma's college prospects could be affected if it comes out that her education was funded by stolen money." He paused, looking directly into my eyes. "I do not want to hurt innocent people, Christopher. But I will not stand by and watch my grandson be victimized anymore. They made their choices when they decided to steal from you and lie to us. Now they have to face the consequences." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of hope. The alliance I had always needed was finally forming, and it was with the person who had the power and resources to actually make a difference. My grandfather was not just offering emotional support. He was offering to wage war on my behalf, using every tool at his disposal to get justice for the years of mistreatment I had endured. 1 week later, my grandfather called a family meeting under the pretense of discussing my behavior and attitude problems. He told my parents that he wanted to have a serious conversation about my accusations and find a way to move forward as a family. My mother immediately agreed, probably thinking this was her chance to further cement the narrative that I was a jealous, difficult son who needed to be managed. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at my grandparents' house. When my parents and Emma arrived, they expected to find a typical family gathering, maybe with my grandmother serving coffee and cookies while we all sat around the living room, having an uncomfortable but ultimately reconciliable conversation about sibling rivalry and family dynamics. Instead, they walked into something that looked more like a criminal proceeding. My grandfather had arranged the dining room like a conference room, with all the chairs facing a presentation area, where he had set up a flip chart and document projector. 2 additional people were seated at the table: Margaret Hoffman, the family law attorney my grandfather had consulted, and David Chen, the private investigator who had compiled our evidence. The looks on my parents' faces when they realized what was happening were almost worth all the years of pain I had endured. My mother went completely white, her confident smile evaporating as she recognized that this was not going to be the character assassination of Christopher that she had been expecting. My father looked like a man who had just realized he was about to be audited by the IRS. Emma just looked confused, clearly having no idea why lawyers and investigators were involved in what she thought was a family discussion. My grandfather wasted no time with pleasantries. "Please, everyone sit down," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. "We are here to discuss some serious financial and legal irregularities that have come to light, and we need to address them immediately." Attorney Hoffman took over the presentation, laying out the evidence with professional precision. She started with the bank records showing my grandparents' monthly payments to my mother, then cross-referenced them with Preston Academy's tuition payment schedule. The correlation was undeniable and clearly intentional. "Mrs. Mitchell," the attorney said, addressing my mother directly, "you accepted 23 payments, totaling $11,500 from your in-laws, under the representation that this money would be used to support Christopher's education. Instead, you deposited this money into a separate account and used it to pay for Emma's private school tuition. This constitutes theft by deception under state law." My mother tried to interrupt, to explain that she had used the money for education, just not Christopher's education. But the attorney continued without acknowledging her protests. Furthermore, Attorney Hoffman said, "Our investigation has revealed a pattern of systematic financial and emotional abuse directed toward Christopher, including the appropriation of gifts intended for him and the redistribution of family resources based on deceptive information about Emma's parentage." That was when she dropped the biggest bombshell. The private investigator presented his findings about Emma's true father, complete with birth certificate documentation and evidence of the original child support payments. Emma gasped audibly when she heard Marcus Webb's name, clearly learning this information for the first time. My father buried his face in his hands, and my mother started crying again. But this time the tears looked genuine rather than manipulative. "The systematic favoritism shown toward Emma," the attorney continued, "appears to be motivated by Mrs. Mitchell's desire to compensate for the deceptive circumstances of Emma's birth and Mr. Mitchell's resentment toward a situation he felt trapped in. Christopher became the scapegoat for family dysfunction that predated his birth. My grandfather then presented our demands, reading from a prepared statement with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years managing other people's finances and was not going to be manipulated or bargained with. "You have 30 days to make full restitution of the stolen funds, with interest, totaling $15,000. Christopher's BMW will be returned to him immediately. You will establish a protected education fund for Christopher that cannot be accessed by anyone else in the family. You will provide a written apology acknowledging the systematic mistreatment he has endured. And you will agree to family counseling to address the underlying issues that created this situation. The alternative," Attorney Hoffman explained, "was criminal prosecution for theft and fraud, civil action to recover damages and legal fees, and full public disclosure of the family's deceptive history, including Emma's true parentage." My father was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "We will do whatever you want," he said. "Please do not destroy our family over this." My mother was sobbing uncontrollably now, but they were not the performative tears she had used at our previous family dinner. These were the tears of someone who had been caught in lies so deep and complex that there was no way to dig out of them gracefully. Emma was staring at her hands, clearly processing the revelation that the man she had called Dad her entire life was not her biological father. The meeting lasted for 2 more hours, as Attorney Hoffman outlined the specific terms of restitution and the timeline for compliance. My grandfather made it clear that this was not a negotiation. These were the terms that would allow the family to move forward without involving law enforcement and the court system. As everyone was preparing to leave, Emma finally spoke up, her voice small and shaky. "Christopher," she said, "I did not know about any of it. I thought the car was a family car, and I thought the money for my school was just what families do for each other. I never knew you were working so hard, or that you were not getting help from Grandma and Grandpa." I looked at my sister, really looked at her. For the first time in years, she was 18 years old, a senior in high school, and she had been living in a bubble of privilege without understanding the cost of that privilege to other people. She was not evil or manipulative like our mother. She was just naive and sheltered, raised to believe that her needs naturally took priority over everyone else's. "I know you did not know," I told her. "This is not your fault." But I also did not absolve her completely. She was old enough to have noticed the inequality, old enough to have questioned why she got everything while I got nothing. Her ignorance was partly willful, partly the result of being raised to see herself as the center of the universe. My parents left that day looking like people who had been through a natural disaster. The carefully constructed world they had built around their lives was crumbling, and they were going to have to figure out how to rebuild their lives around the truth. It was not going to be easy, and their marriage might not survive the revelations. But that was no longer my problem to solve. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, I found myself sitting in the driver's seat of my restored BMW, pulling into the parking lot of State University, where I had just finished my first semester as a transfer student majoring in business administration. The late afternoon sun was reflecting off the hood of my car, and I could not help but smile at how different my life had become. The restitution had been paid in full, with interest, exactly 30 days after my grandfather's ultimatum. $15,000 had been deposited into a new bank account that only I could access, overseen by a trust that my grandfather had established. My parents had liquidated some of their retirement savings and taken out a loan to make the payment, which seemed appropriate given the years of financial damage they had inflicted on my future. The BMW had been returned to me the day after the family meeting, freshly detailed and with a full tank of gas. Emma had cleaned out all of her personal items and left the keys on the kitchen counter with a note, apologizing for taking something that was never hers to begin with. Driving my own car again after months of taking buses and walking had felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that I had not even realized was missing. But the money and the car were just the beginning of the changes in my life. My grandmother and I had spent hours going over my academic transcripts and planning my transfer to a 4-year university. With the financial support that had always been intended for me, I was able to quit one of my part-time jobs and focus more seriously on my education. My grades improved immediately when I was not exhausted all the time, and I discovered that I actually had a talent for business and finance that had been buried under years of stress and fatigue. The protected education fund my grandfather had established was now worth $25,000, enough to cover my remaining tuition and living expenses through graduation. My grandparents had also helped me find a better apartment near campus, a 1-bedroom place with actual furniture, and enough space for a proper desk where I could study without my books scattered on the floor. The family dynamics had shifted dramatically, but in ways that were ultimately healthier for everyone involved. My mother had started therapy to deal with the guilt and shame of what she had done, and slowly, very slowly, we had begun to rebuild a relationship based on honesty rather than manipulation. She had written me a 5-page letter acknowledging every instance of favoritism and unfair treatment she could remember, taking full responsibility for the pain she had caused, and promising to do better in the future. My father had been the harder one to forgive, partly because his role had been more passive but also more enabling. His silence during years of mistreatment had been almost worse than my mother's active favoritism, because it had made me feel like there was no one in my corner, no one who would stand up for basic fairness. But he too had started therapy, and he had begun making efforts to connect with me as an adult, asking about my classes and my goals in ways that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Emma had probably been affected the most by the revelations about her parentage, but she had handled it with more maturity than I had expected from someone who had been sheltered her entire life. She had reached out to Marcus Webb, her biological father, and had started building a relationship with him and his family in Denver. She had also insisted on getting a part-time job to help pay for her own expenses, saying she wanted to understand what it felt like to work for the things she needed. Our relationship as siblings was still complicated, but it was honest now in a way it had never been before. She was going to Princeton in the fall on a partial scholarship, and she was planning to major in social work, which she said was partly inspired by seeing how family dysfunction could damage people who did not deserve it. I was not ready to call us close, but we were at least able to be in the same room without the tension and resentment that had poisoned our interactions for years. The biggest change, though, was in my relationship with my grandparents. My grandfather had become more than just a loving relative. He had become a mentor and advocate who taught me that standing up for yourself did not make you selfish, and that family loyalty should never require accepting abuse. He helped me understand that the people who truly love you will fight for your well-being, even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. My grandmother, for her part, had been horrified to learn how her money had been misused, but she had channeled that horror into making sure I knew how valued and supported I was. She had started calling me every Sunday to check on my classes and my health, and she always ended our conversations by telling me how proud she was of the young man I had become, despite the obstacles I had faced. As I sat in my car outside the university library, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me. I had learned that justice sometimes requires patience and strategic thinking, not just righteous anger. I had learned that the truth, even when it is painful and complicated, is always better than living in a web of lies and deception. Most importantly, I had learned that family is not just about blood relations or legal obligations. It is about people who choose to support and protect each other, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice. My grandfather had shown me what real family loyalty looked like when he chose to investigate my accusations rather than dismiss them, when he hired lawyers and investigators to get to the truth, when he was willing to risk family harmony to ensure that justice was done. That kind of loyalty, based on love and principles rather than fear and obligation, was something I wanted to model in my own relationships going forward. I was also learning to forgive, not because forgiveness was required or expected, but because carrying anger and resentment was exhausting and ultimately self-defeating. Forgiving my parents did not mean forgetting what had happened or pretending it was okay. It meant choosing to focus my energy on building a better future rather than relitigating a painful past. Looking ahead, I had goals and dreams that felt achievable for the first time in years. I wanted to finish my business degree and maybe go on to get an MBA. I was thinking about specializing in nonprofit management or family financial planning, fields where I could help other people navigate complex family dynamics and financial challenges. The pain I had experienced had given me insights and empathy that could be valuable in helping others who faced similar situations. I also wanted to maintain the close relationship I had developed with my grandparents, who had shown me what unconditional love and support really looked like. When I got married someday, when I had children of my own, I wanted to create the kind of family environment where everyone felt valued and supported, where resources were shared fairly, and where love was demonstrated through actions, not just words. As the sun began to set behind the university buildings, I started my car and headed home to my apartment, grateful for everything that had changed and optimistic about everything that was still to come. The young man who had arrived at his grandparents' house by taxi 6 months ago, broken down and defeated, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, more confident, and more hopeful about the future. The road had not been easy, and there were still challenging conversations and healing processes ahead for our entire family. But I had learned that sometimes the most difficult journeys lead to the most meaningful destinations, and that the people who truly love you will walk alongside you even through the darkest valleys. My grandfather had taught me that standing up for what is right is never easy, but it is always worth it. And sometimes, when you find the courage to speak your truth, you discover that you are not as alone as you thought you were. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who were treating you unfairly, even though it felt scary and difficult? What gave you the strength to fight for yourself when the people closest to you were not supporting you? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below, because I think we all need to know that we are not alone when we face these kinds of family challenges. If this story resonated with you, Please give it a thumbs up to help others find it who might be going through similar situations. And do not forget to subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming family drama and finding the courage to stand up for yourself. Sharing these experiences helps all of us feel less alone and more empowered to create the lives we deserve. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you remember that you are worthy of love, respect, and fair treatment, no matter what anyone else tries to tell you. Sometimes the family that fights for you is not the one you were born into, but the one that chooses to see your worth and stand up for your dignity. Hold on to those people, and never be afraid to fight for the life you deserve.